Some snaps for Alden. Okay, so I guess that's my cue to begin. Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to welcome you to DFA Days of Summer, and in particular, the Spark series. So bringing some inspiration and design innovation right to your living room through a weekly webinar. This is just one of the many ways that DFA National and the broader network are working hard behind the scenes to harness the spirit and community of Design for America virtually. So just to begin, I'll introduce myself. My name is Michelle Pannone. I'm an assistant professor at Marywood University, which is located in Scranton, Pennsylvania. My teaching and research focuses on the communication of design ideas to diverse audiences, in addition to the execution of full-size community design build projects. Throughout my 5 years studying architecture at Virginia Tech, I was an active leader in the formation of our DFA chapter, of course with guidance from Rob Calvi, who you guys may know, who handed the baton to me quite a while ago now when I say it. Yes, Heart Rob. Hopefully he'll see this, or maybe he's on the call. So it's Design for America, and through Design for America that I really discovered my passion for teaching and empowering the next generation of leaders. I then went on to pursue my graduate studies at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, Sweden, where I focused on urbanism at the intersection of human-centered design and public space. I've attended Leadership Studio Design Summit, or I think that's what we called it most recently, I think the past like 7 years. So if you've attended in those years, we've probably crossed paths, and I'd love to hear from you again. I will surely miss Chicago this August, but I'm excited to be with you through DFA Days of Summer over the next couple months. So let's get into our Zoom best practices. I'm sure many of you are already experts, but we'll just go through it anyways. The majority of the time, everyone will be muted to ensure quality of our call, but it's really important to Eugene and I that you feel engaged in the conversation, whether that be through head nods, through smiles, through comments in the chat. Please feel free to add questions, resources, anything that you might find relevant to our discussion. Don't feel like you're flooding the chat. We would absolutely love that. Anything you might want to add, even as we're talking. However, we'll get to the Q&A section. And if you have a question or comment, we would invite you to turn your microphone on when I call on you, and then you could then unmute yourself and share. So we'd ask that you'd write your question in the chat, and then I would kind of direct that question to you as I see the flow fit. I think that's just about it, but I do want to remind you that this conversation is recorded. It'll be shared with the DFA network along with a blog post shortly afterwards. Okay, so that's all our kind of like housekeeping. So I say we can get into our topic now. Eugene is also an educator, and together we're very excited to be hosting you all this wonderful Wednesday afternoon to discuss bringing ethics to design education. Currently positioned at a time of exceptional change, how might design education respond, react, and demand reinvention given the pressing needs of society? Just last week, the Spark Series talk, led by Liz and Andrew, teed up our talk pretty well as the conversation ended discussing the silver platter that projects are often put on preparing for student engagement. When in reality, we'd like to say that much of the formative work in the process is in the actual scoping component. So this brought about a very interesting and necessary conversation, challenging the format of project scoping and delivery that Eugene and I have had the privilege to discuss together leading up to this afternoon. So with that in mind, we're excited to dive deeper into design ethics. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to Eugene with the question of the afternoon: how might ethics permeate design education? Alrighty, Eugene, take it away.
Thanks, Michelle. Last week in Liz Gerber's talk, I think I remember her promising to you that this week I will come and share some wisdoms. She lied. Now, to be fair, she didn't know she was lying, so we'll forgive her. Nevertheless, I have no wisdom to share, so please disabuse yourself immediately of that particular hope and expectation. So today, for possibly the first time in my academic career, I'm going to talk about something that I know almost nothing about. Well, okay, maybe more accurately, recalling certain past instances when I may have, as is befitting a white male, talked with a great degree of confidence about things that I know nothing about. Today might be the first time when I admit to not knowing what I'm talking about. So instead of wisdom, I will offer one confession, one provocation, and one invitation. So I'll start with a confession. At this point, I've been teaching design thinking for about a decade, first at Stanford, then at the University of Vermont, and now at Dartmouth. And I believe that up until now, I have failed as a design educator. And I might go so far as to say that in this particular regard, the entire field of design education has been failing our students, but because the purpose of this part of the talk is to admit a personal shortcoming and not necessarily to throw shade on an entire industry, I'm going to keep it personal. So here's why I believe I failed. I have endeavored to arm my students, and I believe I've been doing that reasonably successfully, at least as indicated by various measurable student outcomes. I've endeavored to arm my students with a host of design tools and design abilities. So picking up examples that Liz mentioned last week, I've been teaching conceptual cognitive tools such as the 5 whys. I've been teaching methods and techniques such as stakeholder maps. I've been teaching processes such as prototyping. And I have hoped that the students in my classes will graduate and go on to use these newfound powers for good. And it's with some degree of embarrassment that I admit how long it took me to come to the realization that hoping is not enough. When you teach people how to design cool products and you hope that they do this ethically, things like this happen. What you're about to see is an automatic soap dispenser, and this is a white person using it. Soap dispenser sees the hand, dispenses some soap. Here's what happens when a black person tries to use it. So here was a sensor, an optical sensor in this case, that just decided certain people are not worth dispensing soap to. Now, this is a pretty blatant and kind of easy to see and easy to understand example of a design ethics violation. This one happens to be along the dimension of inclusivity and racial justice, but examples of ethically complicated design are all around us, and they're present in every single design discipline, not just product design, but also graphic design, UI, UX, et cetera. And they are present in every domain of human endeavors in which design has a presence, which is just about every domain of human endeavors, including healthcare, policy, et cetera. Last year, Liz and I witnessed a fascinating discussion on the Stanford Design Alumni Listserv about Juul, the vaping product. And there were very passionately articulated arguments on both sides of the debate, both in the direction of this product is helping thousands of people quit smoking, to this product is getting thousands of young people addicted to nicotine. How do you wrestle with that ethical trade-off? Last week, Liz also talked about personal shopping services like Instacart. Right, so Instacart designed to provide the convenience of delivered groceries to its users, and it's designed to provide some supplementary income to its shoppers. But what happens in the time of COVID when grocery shopping becomes a risk to your health, and we find economically underprivileged individuals who make up most of the ranks of Instacart's shoppers now at a higher risk of exposure to infection? I have done nothing to help my students grapple with these questions. So that was the confession. The related provocation or assertion is this: every design choice is a moral choice, whether you think of it that way or not. When you choose who you're designing for, you're also choosing who to exclude. when you choose a specific material from which to manufacture a product, you're making specific choices about environmental impact, use of natural resources, etc. This means that in order to be complete, design education has to, by necessity, not as optional icing on the cake, include ethics training. So the project on which I'm now embarking, and right now I'm very much in the beginning stages of my research and therefore also in the completely overwhelmed phase at the moment, is I want to create a design ethics course. The hope is that in developing some curriculum that could be used in design classes, I can help my students have some tools with which they can analyze the ethical implications of their design work, and hopefully eventually even share this stuff to other design educators. The good news is that some great work has already been done on this so far. So I'm particularly grateful to designer Kat Zoe for her thinking about this. I recommend that you guys, if you're interested in this stuff, watch the talk she gave recently about this. I'm putting a link to that in the chat. And also have a look at her website, designethically.com, putting a link to that in the chat as well. Yoav Schlesinger, a friend of DFA, recently gave a talk about his efforts to bring ethical thinking to design companies at a talk he gave just last year, the link to which I'm also putting in the chat for you guys. So there's that. The designer and author Mike Montero has written a designer's code of ethics. It's great. Again, link to that coming in the chat for you guys so you can have a look. There's that one. The designer code of ethics is great, and I agree with just about every word in it. But it has a similar quality to Dieter Rams' 10 principles of good design, in that it's a list of specific features and manifestations of what makes for good ethical design, but it's not yet a robust framework that can help people navigate the difficult moral trade-offs that are inherent in their design work. And I think what we owe to our students is that kind of framework, that kind of set of tools. I should say, by the way, that as a designer and therefore a complete ethics ignoramus, a lot of my thinking about this is and will continue to be guided by my conversations with my partner, Kate Nolfi, who is a philosophy professor at the University of Vermont. And I think that the project of designing a design ethics course really can't happen without meaningful collaboration of somebody specifically trained in the ethics part. So maybe I will offer one piece of wisdom today. If you can, marry a philosophy professor. The downside is you will never win an argument, but the upside is that they can be really useful sometimes. And by the way, and if you yourself are studying philosophy and you have concerns about the employability of philosophy majors, just consider that there was a person at Google who had the job title of design ethicist and product philosopher. So there you go. So here's what I would love. I would love it if we could help students in a systematic and sophisticated manner beyond just the oversimplified bumper sticker version of utilitarianism that values the greatest good for the greatest number. I would love it if we could help our students think through the ethical issues surrounding both the process of design as well as the outputs of that process. Kat Zoe, the designer I recently mentioned, she splits these into intents and results, and she correlates them respectively with the ethical theories of deontology and consequentialism. The good news is, I think, that we already have robust analogous mechanisms in place from which we can learn, both on the process side and on the outcomes side. So on the process side, so there's a bit of an analogous example, but in the field of primary academic research that deals with human subjects, we have the IRB, the Institutional Review Board. And the IRB, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is an academic body that requires researchers to think through the ethical implications of their work, including potential harm to their research subjects of any study that interfaces with people. And so abstracting for a second about how well it works in any particular instance, or how pleasant the process of going through an IRB approval is. In the IRB, what we have an institutionalized space and framework for evaluating ethical questions about process. We have, in the existence of IRB, a way of codifying the importance of evaluating ethical soundness of a process. It forces practitioners to grapple these questions. So what if we had something like that for design? What if we had a way for students to grapple with those questions? On the outcomes side, the analogous bit of inspiration here is Lifecycle Assessment, or LCA. So in the field of sustainability, Lifecycle Assessment is a way to measure and calculate a product's total environmental impact, carbon footprint, et cetera. So in the case of a manufactured object, you can assess environmental impacts by considering what it takes to extract and process raw materials, the processes involved with shipping and manufacturing of the object, delivering, distribution, use, and eventual disposal. So I want to be clear that I'm not advocating for coming up with metrics and numbers to assess the ethics of a design product or system or service. I think numbers per se in this particular case would be inappropriate because of the incommensurability of different dimensions of ethical evaluation, right? But the point is that in life cycle assessments, we have an example of a formalized, accepted framework within a particular discipline for assessing the potential negative impacts of a design product. So what if we had something like this for design outputs writ large? And what if we had our students grapple with that? There are a lot of designers and ethicists who've put forth various proposals about ethical values that designers should strive for. In the field of, in the context of UI, UX, for example, it's been suggested that values like privacy, autonomy, trust, transparency, accountability, those have been cited as ethical. And I think, well, maybe we can all, or many of us can agree and kind of get on board with a bunch of those. What I'm hoping for is a little bit deeper than that. What I'm hoping for is how can we help students identify why are those values ethical? What is it about them that makes them worth shooting for in a design process or a design product? So I think, so in other words, I think there are two projects here. Project one is the project of identifying the fundamental ethical values that we should be shooting for, or at least identifying the mechanisms by which we can identify the appropriate values in the appropriate context. And then project two becomes, okay, now that we're on board with a certain set of ethical values, how do we figure out how to manifest those ethical values in our design process and in our design context? How do we realize or respect or maximize those values within a particular design context? As a perverse example of what happens when you don't do step one, when you don't kind of critically reevaluate what are the design values worth shooting for, and when you kind of blindly agree on a set of values. So as a perverse example, here's a case from when an ethical value is accepted without being sufficiently questioned. So I'm going to read you a quote here. This is from Ta-Nehisi Coates, The Case for Reparations, which, by the way, is required reading, especially for those of you who look like me. And just for everyone's convenience, I'm going to put a link to the article in the chat. So the quote: "The American real estate industry believed segregation to be a moral principle. As late as 1950, the National Association of Real Estate Boards Code of Ethics warned that, quote, a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood any race or nationality or any individuals whose presence will be clearly detrimental to property values. A 1943 brochure specified that such potential undesirables might include, quote, a colored man of means who was giving his children a college education and thought they were entitled to live among whites. Racism didn't just happen in this country. It was designed. It was designed in 1940s real estate codes, and it was designed today in a soap dispenser. And we don't get to shirk the responsibility of undesigning it. And that means we don't get to avoid the questions of ethics and design in industry and in the classroom. So the invitation is, join me, please. I'm in the stage of collecting materials about design ethics and have a fat folder of articles and other resources that I can share with anyone who would like to see them. And I'm planning to spend the summer educating myself about this stuff so that eventually I can teach it. I would love, of course, to have the input of anybody who's interested to think through these things, anyone with any experience, interest, opinions about this stuff. I want to do this right, which means doing it with people who are smarter and more knowledgeable than I am, which is all of you guys. So if you have readings to suggest or people I should talk to, please let me know. Give me a shout. I'll put my email address in the chat. And I would love to keep talking about this stuff with anyone who's interested. Meanwhile, I feel like I've been babbling long enough, so thank you for letting me. Now, who's got thoughts about this?
Okay, Eugene, thank you so much for sharing your insights and pertinent case studies. We have a pretty great conversation going on in the chat right now, and I'd love to kind of open that up to also be part of our verbal chat. There was a question, well, actually, yeah, we could start with a question. There was a question that came quite early in the chat. I believe it was from Sahidi. I'm just scrolling up to get to it. And it's something that is really fundamental to how we kind of design courses and think about curriculum design as design educators. Sahidi, would you like to share your question?
Sure. So my question was, how do we make sure that these design code of ethics are intersectional? And how can we make sure that there is a broader understanding of what ethics means?
Yeah, that's a fabulous question. Who's got thoughts about that one? Michelle, do you have, because I am going to very honestly position myself as somebody who has no authority whatsoever to speak about any of this. I'm just somebody who is determined to learn enough to eventually be able to speak about it. But that's a fantastic question and one that has to be addressed. Yeah, Michelle, do you have thoughts about this?
I mean, my first thoughts from some of the things that Eugene and I have had the privilege to discuss has to do with like the fact that doctors have a code of ethics and lawyers and real estate agents, and these are all like disciplinary or very specific to their particular job. But like the IRB, for example, was one that cross-cuts several disciplines. So it's like easier for us to kind of relate to design ethics and any sort of kind of framework in that same manner. But the development then thereof has to be also equally interdisciplinary, right? And also engage many voices. So I'm there with you, Eugene. I'm not an expert at all, but I think like the beginning of this conversation this afternoon is definitely a great start. And further in the series, the Spark series, we're going to continue to discuss many topics that are really similar as well.
Yeah, I think my only other thought about that question is, I think we have to strive to include as many voices as possible in the conversation, right? In determining how do we study and teach ethics, we have to make sure that we have voices that represent lots of different kinds of people. You know, in the very easy example of the toy dispenser or the soap dispenser, right? That would not have happened if they had a single Black designer on the team. That never would have happened, right? So in thinking about what kinds of ethical values do we teach and what kinds of frameworks do we teach, we have to lean on readings from scholars who represent different identities. And we also have to include in the conversation designers and educators who represent different identities, and students who represent different identities, in the hopes that what comes out is as inclusive as it possibly can be, knowing, of course, that we're probably not going to get it right on the first try or the second one.
Yeah, most definitely. And is it really a framework that's necessary, or a set of rules, or is it a tradition or a sense of obligation, right, that the designer then assumes as they kind of take on their problems? And I kind of bring that up, of course, because of this great conversation going on in the chat. M. Kuznetsov, would you like to share a little bit more about the civil engineering tradition? And maybe we could have a conversation about ways that possibly, or other ideas that might be translated similar to the field of design.
Sure. Yeah, a little background on me. I'm I went to Case Western DFA, and so I am not a civil engineer by trade in any way, shape, or form. But when I first started getting in design, I was really interested in the concept of design ethics and technology ethics, and I think I just picked up a book in the business building about it. And I took a class on corporations where we talked about ethics and started thinking about that in design. And it's still not a very popular field, and as Mike Montero mentions, lawyers have a code of ethics, doctors have a code of ethics, and so but designers don't, but engineers do. And so the Iron Ring tradition is a Canadian tradition, which is weird because you don't think about stuff being geographical anymore. But civil engineers, once they graduate, take an oath, and then are given iron ring. It used to be iron, now it's stainless steel ring to wear on their right pinky fingers as a reminder of their sort of obligation and what they do. And there's a Wikipedia link in the chat. They wear it, and it's supposed to remind them that their actions have consequences, often because the rumor is the original ring came from a failed structure. So understanding their designs have consequences, and to be reminded of that constantly and not just when things collapse.
Thank you, Em.
I think this is such an interesting conversation, and I really appreciate you provoking. I love that word, this conversation. I'm here for all the same reasons it seems like a lot of us are. I've been reflecting a lot on how my role as an instructor of design thinking has been willfully ignoring the potential negative impact that I'm sending students out into the world equipped to have. And I think that it is time for us as designers, both practitioners and educators, to be much more reflective, but more sort of time sensitively. I'm facilitating a committee at the University of Rochester to reimagine higher education post-COVID. And I sent all of these brand new designers, none of them have done design thinking before, but it's a great committee. I sent them all out into the field to conduct empathy interviews. And I started getting all these questions from these new designers, faculty and staff and students, asking, well, someone made a really xenophobic comment. Should I include that? You told us we need to empathize with the people that we're interviewing. Should I be empathizing with them for feeling racist feelings? Is that part of the perspective I should be including? And I told them, yes, they should bring it in because this is important knowledge for us to have. But I also fundamentally started to challenge myself a little bit about whether empathy should be the cornerstone of design thinking education without having an ethical compass to calibrate us. And this isn't a question so much as it is a really emphasis on the urgency of this to me. And I think to a lot of us who are using these and feeling all of a sudden that we have a loaded gun, but no training in how to use it all of a sudden. So I just really appreciate this. And certainly if anyone does have any experience leading committees like this and wants to reach out to me separately, I would really value that insight, especially with people who you don't have time to necessarily give a full training to. And yeah, so I'll drop my email in the chat. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Julia. That's really helpful. I think it's also a great point to then transition to a little bit the student's perspective So I have in here Malika, if I would invite you to join our conversation and maybe ask your question or any other thoughts you want to add.
Yeah, hi. So I'm just a recent graduate from the Rhode Island School of Design. I studied industrial design there, and I'm part of the DFA team there, part of the exec board, just recently become an alum. And something that I really struggled with and grappled with throughout my entire time in industrial design was that I really felt like it didn't have that humanist perspective or understanding how our practice then related to the world around us. We'd learn about, yeah, the manufacturing techniques or how do you draw something, how do you ideate, but not really making those connections of how then this impacts other people. Or if you're not taught to think about different community groups, how do you know to, reflect about your design in different ways? And so this is a conversation that me and some of my other teams and through DFA a little bit as well, we've been trying to bring into our school and have this conversation more and maybe talk about having classes. We organized an event trying to have this conversation. But one thing I just wanted to ask is, how do you guys think we can bring these kind of things in more? Because though we've been trying to start this conversation, schools aren't always the most receptive, don't always see design in the same way. And I think it's a conversation that's not, it's not optional. So yeah, so that's my question.
I'm gonna have Eugene answer this one first, and then I'll give you my 2 cents as well.
I mean, mine might be like a penny and a half, but I think so. One thing that I have learned again and again and again is that academia moves at a glacial pace. That's always been true. I am always frustrated at that, but I see no immediate signs that pace is going to accelerate anytime soon. So, which is discouraging sometimes, but also the kind of the upshot of that is, even though you might not feel like the issues you want to raise are being heard, anytime students voice a concern, that has a cumulative effect on the institution over time. So I think my best advice is, please keep talking, like keep demanding that your professors teach topics that you think are important. Keep demanding that your deans incentivize through course development grants and other means, ways for the faculty to build important conversations into the curriculum. Keep through the organization of events, mini conferences, workshops, et cetera, making the topics that you feel are not heard as much as they need to be. Keep making them heard on campus. And yeah, it may not be the case that you put on a workshop or have a conversation with a faculty member and all of a sudden the next year, boom, the thing you want is part of the curriculum. But believe me that all of those things do add up, and institutions by and large do pay attention to students' concerns and student voices, even if they're sometimes slow to implement those concerns and voices. So absolutely keep speaking up, and absolutely change curricularly will happen.
I could not agree more with that, but I also kind of want to acknowledge for sure that, I mean, this is also on the educators and the administration. You as a student have a lot of power, and I think that one of the incredible things that Design for America gives you in being a part of it is kind of that framework to work through. And also, like, maybe you could say something in a very optimist way, like, since this is kind of missing, Design for America is hosting an event on X, or we'd like to invite you to this talk, and then purposely invite different stakeholders that might have a good, not necessarily a good understanding of the topic, but that maybe they should be speaking out about it. So I think that's one way that you can kind of use DFA, but also not being afraid to, I think, ask questions or ask areas of opportunity when you're in a course as well. So if you aren't getting the examples or case studies that you feel are appropriate, to actually ask about them or to pursue those interests. And in addition, I think like it's on the educators and administration as well to fundamentally really align themselves towards these kind of ethical solutions as well. So I want to shift the conversation just a little bit to a question from earlier. I'm sorry, there's so many questions. This is awesome, and I'm scrolling and can't task very well. Grace. Okay, that was it. Grace, would you like to join the conversation and ask your question about designing for the problem we're designing for?
Yeah, let me take a second. Let me get my video on. Sorry.
No problem. Hi, Grace.
Okay, yeah. Hello. I'm a part of DFA from Brown, so Brown RISD, and I've been thinking a lot about, especially just kind of talking about the intersections of kind of why we design and what we're designing, thinking about when we get to decide like what the problem is and how that intersects with ethics and ethical design, because I think a lot of times as designers we can kind of pick and choose where we think quality of life is lower, and that could be really ableist and really problematic to do. And so I just kind of wonder, if we're trying to make things that are for everybody and that are ethically based, how do we also counteract our own ideas about what we need to fix in the world and like who is struggling because their life isn't as good as someone else's, if that makes sense.
Eugene, would you like to add your 2 cents? Or are you telling me that it's
I went first last time. I feel like maybe I should give you the chance to go this time. Unless you just like need 30 seconds to pull more thoughts together and then see if I can improvise something.
No.
But why don't you take a...
I mean, I have my thoughts together because Eugene,
Yeah, go for it.
we spent a good amount of our conversation preparing for this on the project scoping phase and really discussing like, are we doing you a disservice by doing the project scoping in advance? So we take like, as educators, we take a huge amount of pride in like curating this particular experience for you. So curating for the student, whether it's like, we want them to go through the whole design phase and they only have 10 weeks. So we're gonna kind of like set them up with these certain amount of parameters to make sure that they can successfully complete it. But then we also say like, we want you to see failure and learn from that failure. Now, are we like allowing you the failure in the correct part of the process in order to establish this type of like embodied knowledge around design ethics? I would argue, and I think Eugene would probably argue the same, that we're actually kind of failing in that category. So maybe we need to upfront, right, allow you some of the project scoping and forming of that group of people you're working with and things like that, so that you can actually kind of gain the necessary muscle in the topic of design ethics that typically I think right now we talk about at the end. So the way that I've seen it with many educators is that after the project is over, there might be an evaluation then, and kind of looking at what has been completed and then evaluating that based on a certain type of criteria or rubric. I don't know, Eugene, if you want to kind of add anything there. I know that's a lot of what we...
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, you and I are totally on the same page about this. I think, and so I think the upshot is, for us as educators, we really need to be allowing ourselves to step back from the scoping and allow students to do that. But whether or not you find yourselves in particular contexts or courses where the faculty does that, I want to encourage students to challenge their professors on project scoping. I feel like if I scoped a project for a team of students for a class and I handed it to them, and that team came back to me and said, hey man, we don't think this is the right problem to be working on. We think the people that you chose as the users are not, like that's not where the focus needs to be. And I think the way you understood their need is like way off base. We think the project as you gave us is not the one we should be working on. I want to believe that I'm the sort of person who in that moment would say, you know what, you guys are right, let's do your thing. Now, is that actually what I would say? And how many of my colleagues would be, would see themselves in this, like, who knows? But I want to encourage you to try. Meanwhile, what we will be doing is working on ourselves to figure out how can we give more of the project scoping powers into the students' hands, which is hard. But we have to do things that are hard.
Yeah, and I think like coming off of the discussion from last week, and I'm gonna add like my twist to it, like pursue your passions too. And that's one of the things as an educator I think is like really, really important. So within every project, there's definitely an opportunity for your passion. You definitely have to find it. And like Eugene said, I think it's completely okay to then challenge or break the rules of that project. Of course, depending upon the professor, I would hope that they valued that, that opinion, but I would say most times if you're, well prepared and have a very clear intent, I would hope that they did value you as an individual and what you bring to your own education. I think we probably have time for maybe one more question, and I just wanted to kind of maybe talk more thematically to address the question that just came in about ownership. I'm gonna just kind of throw that out there and see if Eugene has any quick thoughts about it. How can the communities of interest also take ownership of how we engage with these designs and hold them accountable? That's a question that we could definitely talk a whole afternoon on, but I think it's a great way to wrap up and kind of go into what's also going to be discussed in the future Spark series sessions.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we as educators have to do is train our students to do more of meaningful collaboration with their users. I think at this point, I'm pretty good at teaching a student how to conduct a user interview. Like, I can get a student from I've never done one of these to now I've done one pretty well. I have not at all done a good job of emphasizing, okay, so this interview thing is kind of like this one-way flow of information, not particularly holistic, inclusive, or ownership sharing at all. Instead of teaching my students how to interview, maybe I can teach my students how to organize like a 1-hour joint co-design brainstorming session with their users. Like, maybe I can instill that skill rather than the skill of interviewing. I think the more we can, and it's like a real tactical, like, look, how do you put together a meeting agenda that allows the people you're designing for to also become the people you're designing with? There are best practices for how to run a meeting. There are best practices for how to use Post-its. There are meaningful ways to truly not just pay lip service to, but truly invite people into a collaborative design environment. I don't think I've done a good job at all of teaching my students how to do that and then making them do that with their users. And I think that's got to be one of the keys.
Okay, so I think that kind of wraps us up for the afternoon. I do kind of want to reiterate that from our perspective, success in teaching this kind of design ethics would be it becoming like riding a bike. So a type of embodied knowledge that would have to be developed over a very long period of time, and probably through each and every course that that students engage with throughout their education. So thank you again, Eugene, for such a fruitful conversation, and of course to our audience for providing valuable questions and insights this afternoon. I want to invite you all to join the Slack and subscribe to the DFA newsletter to keep in touch. Please join us next week for the webinar. It will be July 1st, same time and place, unless you guys change your living rooms. Rich, the founder of CoLab, and Danielle of Edelman will discuss It's Personal, Leadership, Equity, and Closing the Gap. So I'm going to hold up you guys for a minute, because the last minute when everybody hops off is like the most important minute. So if anybody would like to exchange some sort of emails, please put them in here. I'm sure Alden will keep this open in case you want to take any links down. So this is me just building time for any sort of networking that wants to happen right now. So you guys don't hop off the call, copying links. Okay, so we'll keep it open probably another few minutes in case you guys need to grab those. Thank you all again for your time and for the incredible conversation. And of course, have a wonderful Wednesday.
Thanks so much,
Thank
Michelle.
you. Thank you. Thank you. So nice to see you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks.
Awesome. So many emails in here.
Yay.
Eugene, I also collected all of the questions and comments to send to you, so you have them.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, that's awesome. I would love.
Thank you, Alden.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thanks,
That was really
Alden.
fun.
Thanks, Rebecca. And
Super
thanks,
fun.
Liz.
And we'll have a lot of the links and talks that were shared today in the blog, so that can also be a resource where we're collecting some of this information.
Yep.
Great.
Awesome. Perfect.
Cool.
Oh, I'm so glad that my dog waited until just now to start whining. Oh,
Thank
I
you.
was very
thank you.
impressed
Thank you
as
for
well.
keeping it together.
I know. All right.
Cool.
Whew, time for a walk with the pup. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Yeah, bye, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
Julia.
Thanks, everybody.